Good evening, everyone. Welcome to those of you in the Conway Hall, and welcome also to everyone watching online. Now, it was Bobby Kennedy who claimed that there's a Chinese curse which says, "May he live in interesting times." Turns out no one could actually stand up the curse. He might have made it up. I'm sure there's a joke in there somewhere, but I'll leave it hanging. It's the second part, though, of the quote that interests me now. He went on, and remember this was 1966, "Like it or not, we live in interesting times. They're times of danger and uncertainty, but they're also more open to the creative energy of men than any other time in history." The two things I might take away from that then are that we often think that the moment we're living through is the big one, and also danger or crisis doesn't preclude creativity or perhaps even advancement, a little bit of opportunity perhaps within the bitter gruel of reality. It certainly feels right now, though, as if the scale and pace of global events means we're living through interesting times. And if we're going to think about crisis, conflicts and consequences, and maybe that's where the optimism creeps in with the consequences, then Neil Ferguson is an excellent guide. Neil's a distinguished historian and well-known commentator. He's currently a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and a senior faculty fellow of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. He's also the author of 16 books, my goodness. Most recently, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, and he's also the co-founder of the new University of Austin, Texas, which describes itself as dedicated to the fearless pursuit of truth. Well, welcome, Professor Ferguson.
Thank you, Edla.
Let's begin with the biggest question of them all, in a way. Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Hamas, Iran, and prickly China. Are we on the brink of World War III?
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be back at Intelligence Squared. I turned 60 the other day, so it's kind of intelligence halved at this point as I descend into my dotage. And when you get asked a question of that magnitude, you have to try to apply some history. I don't think that the 2020s are the 1930s yet, but I think they're much more like the 1930s than I would have expected maybe 10 years ago. And I prefer Cold War II as an analogy to World War III. But when I argued we're in Cold War II, that always implied there's some possibility of World War III, because that's the point about Cold War. When Bobby Kennedy was making up his Chinese prophecy, I should make one up tonight if I can think of one. Maybe we'll have one at the end.
Yes.
It was also a very dangerous time. It was in some ways the high Cold War, just after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin Crisis. The argument I've been making since 2018 is we're in Cold War II, we just didn't notice it. And some people still haven't noticed it. And the reason that I make that case is that really since 1991, we had an interwar period. Now, Cold War I and Cold War II aren't the same. World War I and World War II weren't the same, but they were similar enough for the numbering to make sense. Cold War II represents a new version of Cold War in which China takes the lead role from what was the Soviet Union. And that, I think, has been building since Xi Jinping became the Chinese leader. The thing that people struggle with, maybe just because it's been a while since the Cold War, is that if there is a two-superpower world with ideological difference, which there clearly is, with economic and technological competition, which there clearly is, if they are contesting particular regions, which they clearly are, then certain things will follow from that, as they did in Cold War I. For example, there will be multiple regions and there will be alliances that will form around the superpowers. So when you mention the crises of our time, Ukraine, Israel, and the Palestinians, and you could also mention the question mark that hangs over Taiwan or the South China Sea, you've got to realize that they're connected. They're connected because over time, China and Russia and Iran and North Korea have begun to work together to coordinate their actions. When David Fromm, an old friend of mine, wrote about an axis of evil in 2002, he was making it up. There was no axis of evil in 2001-2. There is an axis now in the sense that Russia's war effort in Ukraine would not be sustainable without Chinese economic support, and Iran's supplies of drones, and North Korea's supplies of ammunition. And Iran is now likely receiving air defense systems from Russia at the same time as Iran sells its oil, supposed to be under sanction, to China. As in Cold War I, we are in a global competition in which there are proxy conflicts. And one or more of these proxy conflicts has the potential to get very dangerous indeed. The most dangerous one is Taiwan. That's the analogy, and let me just finish the thought. If you had a full-blown crisis between the United States and China over Taiwan, if, for example, China blockaded Taiwan tomorrow, that would be very like the Cuban Missile Crisis that Bobby Kennedy lived through. That's, I think, the way to think about it. And of course, they avoided World War III in 1962, but by the skin of their teeth. I mean, Bob McNamara came out saying that they'd been essentially inches away from World War III. And the trouble is, with any Cold War, you are quite close to that nightmare scenario of Armageddon because the superpowers have superpower. They have atomic nuclear power.
And people make mistakes.
And people make mistakes. Or they deliberately take strategic risk and underestimate the consequences.
But just briefly then, when you're thinking about great power alliances, isn't the parallel with World War I and this idea that there could be a mistake, you know, an archduke gets shot and everybody suddenly decides to take up arms, isn't that the more powerful parallel perhaps than the 1930s?
I honestly don't think it is. And I began my career working on that period. I wrote The Pity of War many years ago, trying to think about World War I in a new way. The thing about 1914 is there are multiple empires, and they're not that distinguishable from one another in terms of military capability and economic resources, whereas we're in a two superpower world. I mean, there only are two AI superpowers, to give you just one example. And so it seems to me rather unhelpful to worry about Archduke Franz Ferdinand equivalents being assassinated by Gavrilo Princip equivalents. I don't think it's 1914 we have to worry about. In 1914, the decision makers did not have to worry about nuclear weapons. Once nuclear weapons exist, the risks of great power war become far higher. And this is why George Orwell, in this very city, coined the phrase Cold War. One of the things that was for me a complete epiphany when I started thinking about this back in 2018 was to read the original essay in Tribune magazine, because as a well-known covert Marxist, I always like to go back to read back
the sources.
Well, I've said before, I'm a Marxist, I'm just on the side of the bourgeoisie. I love Orwell. Orwell's essay on the atomic bomb, written just shortly after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is astonishingly brilliant. He says, now there can't be those wars that we've just lived through. And so there will be a peace that is no peace between two or three, he actually estimates 3 atomic powers. Remember, at that point there was only one. But Orwell sees that there will quickly be more than one, that the Soviet Union will become one, and he predicts also brilliantly that China will become one. And he says, in this world where you can't have full-scale war because it's too catastrophic, you will have something that is not really peace either, where he also argues the regimes will become increasingly totalitarian. And this, of course, is a sketch for 1984. It's all there in that one article. So I think you've got to go back and remind yourself what the early Cold War was like, because we're kind of in the early Cold War now.
So let's use that as the backdrop for this conversation and think about, in a bit more detail, about the conflicts that we face. And I'm going to begin with the Middle East, because we talk about it all the time. The horror and the shock of Hamas's attack on October the 7th was, indescribable. But do you think in the 6 months subsequently that Israel has overplayed its hand? If you see the protests that are taking place, the fact that even someone like Joe Biden, who has been a profound and vocal supporter of Israel, has found himself reining in Netanyahu, and perhaps sometimes finding himself saying, okay, take the win. What does that tell us about Israel's action?
Well, first, just let's put it in the Cold War context. One of the striking features of Cold War I was that the Middle East became an absolutely crucial battleground between the superpowers, and there were multiple wars. One of them, in 1973, began with a surprise attack on Israel. And it was almost 50 years to the day later that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched their attack on Israel. I think it's worth beginning any conversation like this by reminding ourselves what we saw that day, because in its brutality, indeed its sadism, the attacks, to my eyes, and I know a lot of my Jewish friends felt the same way, were like a rehearsal for a second Holocaust. And that is how I think many Israelis and many non-Israeli Jews reacted. Since those attacks, I think there has been a tremendous battle to misrepresent Israel's response. And this battle has been waged in the media all over the world. And for a time, Israel comprehensively lost the battle, because we went very quickly from public sympathy with the Israeli victims, including the hostages who are still in captivity, to condemnation of the Israeli Defense Forces' retaliation. And I found that disconcerting because it happened so quickly. There was then a period in which Hamas seemed able to relay directly to the BBC casualty numbers, which were then pretty much uncritically read out.
It's not just the BBC, is it, though? It's
not
the media all over the world.
And it is, the New York Times,
in the end,
CNN.
If reporters can't get into Gaza, then they have to take the information they're given.
If one actually talks to the IDF, a very different picture emerges, in which there were civilian casualties, but they were not wildly disproportionate relative to the casualties of Hamas fighters. Now, I went to Israel about 4 weeks ago and spent time meeting with members of the government and members of the public, people from the left, people on the right. Two really strong impressions. The Israelis remain as politically divided as ever, but they are socially united as I have never known them. And that is because there has been a realization that the enemy of Israel is really out to kill them, to destroy their state, and that what is being aimed at by all Iran's proxies is the destruction of Israel, and that represents, this is what Hamas demonstrated, the potential for a second Holocaust. But second one, let me just make a second point, because it's really, really important to see this. The other source of unity is I met very few people who doubted that Hamas deserved to be destroyed and could not be left in charge of Gaza anymore. I met very few Israelis who questioned the logic of destroying Hamas. So for me, it was very striking, compared with previous visits, how much more cohesive Israeli society felt at this point. And Hamas is almost completely gone. It soon will be completely gone. And considering how difficult that operation was, the warnings that were issued about how difficult it would be, given the tunnel systems, given the use of civilians as human shields, it will, I think, in future be seen as a major success for the IDF, particularly since the IDF has suffered strikingly few casualties. So nobody denies for a second that there were civilians killed, and that's a tragedy.
Okay.
But relative to comparable battles in history, this was a well-executed operation, which I think was necessary.
There is so much to unpack in what you've just said. So let me just talk about some of them.
But,
some of those things.
That's based on my observation and my conversations, trying to understand what was going on.
Let me begin at the end. You say that you think Hamas has been all but destroyed. Can we be sure of that? Can you destroy an ideology? You might.
Yes,
they might perhaps have killed a senior military leader, eliminated a certain number of battalions, but is it possible to lose that ideology? And is there an argument which goes, if 34,000 people have been killed in the process of destroying Hamas, some of them Hamas fighters, some of them civilians, actually are you strengthening the ideology in the minds of those who've been left behind? And where there is no answer to who is going to fill the power vacuum?
You know, two things are becoming very clear. One is that the Israeli government has been right in saying behind Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, the Houthis, stands Iran. And if you doubted it, it's now quite open because the Iranians directly attacked Iran by launching the biggest drone swarm and missile assault, the first direct attack by Iran on Israel. So that's important. The second thing that's important is that the process of reconciliation between Israel and its Arab neighbors has not been derailed by these events. On the contrary,
surely to get it back on track, and we can talk about the Abraham Accords and the progress that they made, there would have to be a solution to the question of Palestinian statehood, or at least the future of the Palestinians post-Hamas, if Israel wants to secure its borders.
Yes, but that solution certainly is not to create a Palestinian state run by Hamas. And that is now off the table.
But
and you won't find,
by the alternative? You've got a situation where...
You're interrupting me rather more than is, I think, needed at this early stage in our conversation. I mean, let's not do the Today program. We're here to talk about history. This is a very historic moment that people, I don't think, get if they follow this on the UK media. The tectonic plates have shifted decisively over the past 10 years away from the centrality of the Palestinian question to the much greater importance of how can the Middle East have a future in which Israel, with all its technological sophistication, can be a partner of the Arab states. And there is nobody in Riyadh, there is nobody in Abu Dhabi who thinks that the fate of the Palestinians and their claim to a state are more important than that bigger question of what is the future of this region. And in that sense, to me, the striking historical feature of October the 7th will be that it does not put the Palestinians back at the center of the debate, because there is no appetite to do that in the Arab capitals. And that's the reality. And I don't base this on the BBC, I base this on the conversations that I have with Saudis, with Emiratis. I've also been in the Gulf recently. It is striking the extent to which the Abraham Accords process, which now predates by some time the Biden administration, is going to carry on. This is a huge detour from it, and that was why it happened. It wasn't surprising to me that something happened last year. At my advisory business, Greenmantle, the brilliant Jay Menz, our Middle East director, kept warning that there would be something to try to derail the Israel-Saudi rapprochement. And sure enough, it happened. We couldn't tell whether it would be West Bank or Gaza or somewhere else. It happened. But I don't think Hamas, which has basically been thrown under the bus by Iran, has a future. I don't think Palestinian Islamic Jihad has a future. It's very hard for anybody to say now how Gaza is going to be run, but it's not going to be run by them. That's clear. And I think what's becoming increasingly apparent to me, the people in the Gulf region realize they've got to come up with some better answer for the future of the Palestinians, because it clearly can't simply be that Israel takes it over and polices it. That's not going to work either. So I think the shifts are going to continue in the direction that we saw pre-2021, and that at the end of it, the situation of Israel will be decisively improved. I asked a veteran of 1973, a general, who had been a junior officer in 73, is the situation of Israel better or worse strategically than it was 50 years ago? And he said, much better, which surprised me. This was not so long ago, but I was surprised, because I was still under the impression I'd just arrived in Jerusalem, that Israel was entirely isolated, that the world was against it. And I came to realize in the course of the week that he was right, that compared with 73, Israel essentially has far better relations with its Arab neighbors and near neighbors, and they understand what the Israelis have been saying for some time, that Iran is the problem. So I learned a lot on that trip, and it's not, I think, the conventional view of what's happening. My prediction would be that it gets worse before it gets better, because Hezbollah still has to be reckoned with. And I think everybody here should be well aware that there is likely to be a bigger and harder battle the IDF has to fight against Hezbollah on the Lebanese border before we get to the next phase of the Abraham Accords. But I think we will get there.
Okay, one quick last question, a big question though. A two-state solution then, given everything you say, Hamas can't be allowed to move back in, the Arab states want a good relationship with Israel. A two-state solution more or less likely now than it was before October 7th?
I think it's far less likely. Far, far less likely. I was at the Munich Security Conference with a large group of Arab and indeed Palestinian friends. And I said, it may well be that the real significance of October the 7th was that it buried the possibility of a Palestinian state. Because not everybody gets a state in history. They don't all get states. You had two great opportunities in the past to make that happen. And the PLO and subsequently Hamas walked away from those opportunities. And I think in history, you're going to get so many chances to achieve statehood. I think this was a catastrophic error. First, it was an error to put Hamas in power. And the people who've paid the price for that have been the Palestinian people. I think it's extremely hard to make a Palestinian state fly now, because I don't see many Israelis in favor of it. I mean, you don't get many people in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem saying, oh yes, now there's a clear case for it. So I don't know. I'm struggling to see that in my lifetime, maybe in my children's lifetime. But at this point, the probability is way down. And we as historians shouldn't be surprised. Not everybody gets a state.
But insecurity and instability continues unless Iran suddenly capitulates.
Well, I wouldn't rule that out. Iran's very weak. Essentially, it relies on cheating on sanctions with China's help. Iran was in a very weak position at the end of 2020, and I thought it was a huge mistake by the Biden administration to relax the pressure, offer sanctions relief, try to resuscitate the Iran nuclear deal, which had been a failure at the time. I don't know why they did that. I remember asking Jake Sullivan, why did you do that? This seemed like a really, like, you're resuscitating the dead parrot in the Monty Python sketch with this nuclear deal, and it's only going to take the pressure off Iran. I mean, after the Soleimani assassination, after Soleimani was killed, there was absolutely zero blowback from Iran worth talking about, because they're weak. More or less, all their security forces are deployed outside Iran in places like Syria. I think Iran is weak. And so over a 10-year time horizon, I think its weakness can be exploited. And over time, its isolation will be the real story. Plus, the regime is hated by ordinary Iranians. I mean, the ordinary Iranian people are the most liberal people in the entire Middle East, apart from the Israelis. The regime is rotten to the core. So I'm an optimist that ultimately, despite the relentless doom-mongering of Western media coverage, things are much better than they were 50 years ago. Israel, of course, is in a stronger position since the Iranian attack, because now it's clear it wasn't just some figment of Bibi Netanyahu's imagination. There really is an octopus in Tehran, and its tentacles really do stretch out in all directions. That's no longer something that you can deny. And, I mean, in that sense, one can be relatively bullish about where the region is going. And I think if you haven't traveled recently to the region and you go to the Gulf, if you talk to people about what's the future of your region, talk to the Saudis, what's your vision of the future? I promise you, they do not begin by saying, well, we really have to have a Palestinian state.
Okay.
In fact, the striking thing is they never mention that. That never comes up, because that's not part of Mohammed bin Salman's vision for Saudi Arabia.
Well, there you go. I told you there would be glimmers of optimism from Neil in what many people might see as quite a bleak picture. Okay, well, let's tackle another really difficult and on the face of it, depressing situation, which is Russia-Ukraine. It's costing lives and money. We heard Rishi Sunak today say that he's going to renew that commitment to defence spending going up to 2.5% by the end of the decade. It has reframed global relations in some way, to go back to your idea of an axis of ill will. Do you think that the NATO alliance was rather over-optimistic in the early days about what Ukraine could achieve?
No, I think we went through a sequence of erroneous assessments. The first erroneous assessment was actually in 2021, when the Biden administration reduced arms shipments to Kyiv, took the sanctions off Nord Stream 2, and said to Putin, if you do anything more, because of course he'd begun an aggression against Ukraine in 2014, there will be sanctions. I mean, then Putin's like, make my day. That was the first mistake, because as I said at the time, Putin's article on the, quote, historic unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people, published July of that year, was a manifesto to annex Ukraine. Yeah. And I was in Kyiv in September that year. I said, you have to understand war is coming, and the American administration doesn't get it. The next erroneous assessment was in the January 2022 phase, when most supposed experts thought that Putin was bluffing. We certainly didn't. Chris Miller at Greenmantle correctly said in January, 80% probable this is a full-blown invasion. That was dead right. And when it happened, there was the third erroneous assessment. We should just get Zelensky the plane ticket and get him out of there because this is over. And Zelensky, in a historic moment, said, no, I need ammunition, not a ticket. And gave that unforgettable speech, I am here, ministers are here. That was a defining historical moment in our time, because it was the moment that the Ukrainian leadership and people said, we are going to fight against Russian colonialism, and we're going to fight for independence, we're going to fight for democracy. And finally, when it was clear that the Russians had utterly bungled the assault on Kyiv, then the Biden administration and other NATO members started to support them. But it was pretty late in the day. The main decisive effort that salvaged the situation was not based on Western support. The Ukrainians won the Battle of Kyiv themselves. And I remember touring the battlefield in September 2022, realizing how astonishing it was that the reservists, because the crack troops were elsewhere in Donbass, the reservists of the Ukrainian army held off the elite special forces of Russia and prevented the breakthrough to Kyiv. We gave Ukraine substantial aid after that, but not enough to win. We gave them enough not to lose, but not enough to win. And my consistent complaint in 2022 was that if you drip feed the support, two things will happen. There'll be a stalemate militarily, and the American public will start to lose interest, because the attention deficit disorder kicks in pretty fast in the country that I've adopted. And so a huge opportunity was lost when the Russians were in flight from Kharkiv and Kherson to finish the job. And we didn't act out of a, I think, misplaced fear of Putin's threats to use nuclear weapons, which we unfortunately were deterred by. And that was a great mistake, because the correct response when somebody threatens to use nuclear weapons, if you have them yourself, is, yes, we have them too. If you use them, we will use them, and ours will probably work better than yours. And that was what should have happened. But Joe Biden and his team have forgotten the lessons of the Cold War. In the Cold War, we learned about deterrence. People who use nuclear threats have to be countered with nuclear threats. Otherwise, they have escalation dominance. Everybody forgot that stuff, and that's why Ukraine didn't win the war when it had a chance.
Is there a different way of looking at this, which is perhaps stalemate is a better outcome if you're watching from Washington? What happens in a Russia without Putin, where Russia has lost?
Is he gone? Did I miss that? I mean, at this point, Putin is not going anywhere, and there is no stalemate. Wars don't tend to produce draws. Sometimes
no, but I'm saying in the event of a defeat. I'm saying in the event of a defeat, isn't a wounded Russia...
A defeat of Ukraine or a defeat of Russia?
A defeat of Russia, isn't that potentially a worse outcome?
No. It would be a fantastic outcome. It would have been a wonderful outcome if in late 2022, the Russian army had cracked, and it nearly did. Remember how incredibly weak they were? There were mutinies by early 2023. We had them, and we failed to follow through. We did not supply the weapons that the Ukrainians begged for, because they knew that they weren't going to be able to achieve a counteroffensive without air superiority. You just can't do that. I mean, infantry counteroffensives without air superiority? Nobody does that. And we were, I think, naive or cynical. Some people were naive. Of course the Ukrainians can break through. And some were cynical. We don't really care if they don't, as long as they kill lots of Russians. The big mistake was to think it's okay to let it drag on. It was never a good idea to let it drag on because A, Russia's a lot bigger than Ukraine. It has a lot more raw resources. The longer the war lasts, the more advantageous to Russia. There isn't going to be a draw in this war where it's like final score 2-2. It won't go to penalties. It's not like football. In this war, if Russia is not defeated, it will win. It will win because Ukraine is not big enough to defeat Russia without sustained support, and sustained Western support has been shown to be questionable since late last year. So I think we made some terrible errors. I think the Western alliance, which is US-led, made some grave mistakes when Russia was on the ropes, and now we have to rectify it. Well spoken today, Rishi Sunak. That was an excellent speech, and I hope very much that European leaders will listen to it and understand that the time for talking about strategic autonomy is past. It is now time to deliver it. That means increased defense spending, and it means really accelerating the aid to Ukraine so that the Ukrainians can stabilize the situation, which is fragile in certain parts of the line, and crucially, make it clear to the Russians that there is no easy win coming this year. There are pressures on Putin too. A full-blown war economy is hard to sustain for any length of time. So we just have to make the cost to Russia significantly higher than it has seemed in the early part of this year. And then I think we get somewhere.
What do you make of the sustained support for Russia within pockets of the Republican Party? You know, Marjorie Taylor
There were
Greene,
useful
Moscow
idiots.
Marjorie.
There were useful idiots in the Cold War
They've
too.
held up the aid package, which was finally passed
Well,
this
thankfully,
weekend.
Speaker Mike Johnson made the right call. And it's interesting that he, who had been with them and had indeed voted against Ukraine aid before, came out and made a spirited speech in favor of aid to Ukraine and got the bill through. Why did he do that? Because he had the intelligence briefings and they frightened the living daylights out of him. Because Mike Johnson suddenly realized what I began by telling you, that there is a large-scale global axis operating not only in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East and in the Far East and elsewhere too, by the way. And it poses a major threat to everyone who believes in the ideals of democracy, of self-government, of the rule of law and individual liberty. So if Mike Johnson can see that reality, I think over time, the isolationists will flake, just as they did in the 30s. It's going to look like a really terrible call to have been an isolationist. Tucker Carlson has destroyed his own reputation. He was a talented broadcaster. He's made himself a laughingstock, a Lord Haw-Haw figure by his trip to Moscow in his sycophantic interview of Putin. I think the isolationist position's crumbling, and Republicans are realizing, and it's quite interesting to follow this, since the attack was on Israel, as well as on Ukraine, a lot of Republicans are rethinking their position. Once you realize that these things are connected, and you can't just cherry pick, you can't sort of throw the Ukrainians under the bus but give aid to Israel. Once you realize they're connected, then the isolationist position collapses. And that's good.
Do you think that will be sustained in the event of a second Trump presidency?
I do actually. You know, two things on this. I currently don't think he's going to win. I think at this point he'll narrowly lose for reasons we can discuss. But if it's very close. It's a pretty coin toss, 50-50 at this point. But if he is re-elected, it's not like Tucker Carlson's going to be Secretary of State. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is not going to be National Security Advisor either. The people who will staff a Trump administration will be Mike Pompeo, Matt Pottinger. There's a bunch of people who we can more or less confidently expect to be involved, maybe Bridge Colby. These people are more hawkish than the Democrats. They're actually criticizing the Democrats for not having been supportive enough of Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan. If you read Mike Gallagher and Matt Pottinger's piece that just came out in Foreign Affairs, It criticizes the Biden administration for not being hawkish enough. And I don't think that Trump, although he's in some ways an isolationist, is a true isolationist. Trump believes in making America great again. He thinks that tariffs are the way to do that, but we already saw in the first administration that when he was shown that the tech war would be more effective than the trade war, he got it. So I don't think it's right to expect, as people have often expected, a re-election of Trump to doom Ukraine. I remember discussing this with the Ukrainian, well, I won't say which minister, a Ukrainian minister who said, people have been warning us about Trump for a better part of a year. But you'll notice, he said, that the aid stopped coming under Biden. And I have to tell you, a great many Ukrainian soldiers have died because of Biden's don't escalate. So it doesn't look quite the way it looks in London when you're in Kyiv. And they're oddly less worried about Trump than people in Western Europe.
And why do you think Trump might not win?
If you look at the swing states, I mean, this gets decided in maybe 5 or 6 states, in places like Arizona and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. It's very, very close. In recent polling, Trump would win if the election were held tomorrow. But then you ask voters, what if he has a criminal conviction? And that flips the independents really strikingly, and this has been polled consistently. If the Stormy Daniels New York criminal case results in a conviction, which I think it will, then I think he has a real problem, because a lot of middle American, middle-of-the-road independent voters, they still think the rule of law is quite an important thing. And I think it hurts him. That's the polling. So a lot can happen between now and November 5th that could change that. The economy, for example, could change direction, or there could be a major episode. God knows. One can't help but fear terrorist attacks in the wake of the destruction of Hamas. I think what often happens with the destruction of these organizations is that they then pop up somewhere else. I mean, look at the way ISIS reconstituted itself in Africa. So I worry that if there were a major terrorist attack between now and the election, that might change things. But on the current trajectory, with the criminal case as a dominant theme, I think he'll narrowly lose come November, which of course creates all kinds of other risks that people don't talk nearly enough about. But that's how I currently think about it. I think there are downside risks to another Biden term that are not trivial, not the least of which is that we would quite possibly face President Harris at some point. And that, from an actuarial point of view, is just a reality. I worry about that. I mean, I worry about that because I don't think she's really ideally suited to the job.
Something that Republicans and Democrats, possibly the only thing, agree on is the concerns about China. The Biden administration has pretty much continued the sort of policies that were initiated under Trump. You're the biographer of Kissinger. Famously, he re-established ties with China, the visit by Nixon in 71, his secret visit in 71, the visit by Nixon in 72. But last year was really quite gloomy about US-China relations before his death. He, though, applied the idea of détente to the Soviet Union. Do you think that idea could be applied to relations with China?
Yes, and I've said so repeatedly, most recently in a foreign affairs piece following Henry Kissinger's death. Let's talk about him because I'm in the midst of writing the second volume, which is the hardest book I've ever written. It's enormously challenging. I mean, everything is documented. The phone calls, everything. It's just like, imagine this room filled with documents, and that would be some fraction of what I'm plowing through at the moment. So what is interesting is that in the later part of his life, and I knew him over 20 years, he became really concerned about this second Cold War. I remember asking him in Beijing in November 2019, are we in a new Cold War? I had no idea what he was going to say. And he replied, we are in the foothills of a Cold War. And that was a great response. I thought, foothills of a Cold War, that is absolutely right. And then a year later, in another interview, not with me, he raised that to the mountain passes of a Cold War. And that was even better. Then in 2022, I think it was, just before his 100th birthday, I asked him again about it. He said, this second Cold War could be worse than the first. I said, why? because of artificial intelligence. And he was deeply preoccupied with the potential weaponization of AI, to the extent that after his 100th birthday, which he celebrated with more parties than I've ever known anybody to throw on their birthday, and there were at least 6, he flew to Beijing and met with Xi Jinping, and that was not some kind of farewell tour. That was to discuss the question of, could there be AI arms limitation talks? Very much by analogy with the strategic arms limitation talks of the 1970s. So I think détente is the rational strategy for the United States today with respect to China, because the United States is not ready for a hot war over Taiwan or the Philippines or any place else. And this is something that isn't widely understood, even in Washington. There is, as you said rightly, a bipartisan consensus that China's a problem. And that was, oddly enough, Trump's achievement. Because prior to 2016, that was not at all the standard view. Trump campaigned on the China issue and was initially ridiculed for it. When he talked about tariffs, most people made fun of him. You'll remember, but people forget this, Arianna Huffington covering the Trump campaign in 2016 on the entertainment pages of the Huffington Post. But if you took him literally and seriously, you understood that the China issue really resonated with voters. More, if certainly as much as, possibly more than the border issue. And Trump, in the very short space of time, by emphasizing that China was a threat, a rival, not, a partner that we could have a win-win partnership with, changed the whole debate. The National Security Strategy document of 2017, which my friend and colleague H.R. McMaster drafted, completely changed US strategy towards China. And the Democrats very quickly fell into line, to the point that they realized very quickly, I remember Larry Summers saying to me, we'll have to run, this is even before Biden was the candidate, we the Democrats will have to run more hawkish than Trump on China. So this is a radical change in the atmosphere. The trouble is, while you're being hawkish on the wicked CCP, the Chinese Communist Party is the root of all evil, you're not noticing that China has overtaken the United States as a manufacturing power to an extent that you cannot appreciate until I tell you these figures. In 2004, China's manufacturing value added was 1/2 of the United States. Today, it's very nearly 2 times that of the United States. In 2 decades, a complete reversal of fortunes. And manufacturing capacity matters in war, because you have to make the ammo. You have to make the missiles. You have to churn out drones, not just in the hundreds, but in the thousands, potentially in the millions. And so it's very risky for the United States to get anywhere close to a shooting war with China when China has the military-industrial base and the US no longer does. In addition, and this is a point which gets us back to history, imagine if there were a Taiwan crisis. Okay, let's just imagine that tomorrow the news you wake up to is that China has blockaded Taiwan, which it could do tomorrow. They rehearsed it when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, and they did another rehearsal around the time of the election in January. What would that mean? Well, it would mean a kind of inversion of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because in 1962, the United States blockaded Cuba. And it was the Soviet Union that had to send a naval expeditionary force across an ocean to run the blockade. This time, China would be the quarantining or blockading power, and the United States would have to send the aircraft carrier strike groups. I remember asking an eminent member of the administration, why is it you want Biden to be Khrushchev? That doesn't seem like an obvious thing to want to be. But you'd be in Khrushchev's situation where you would have to choose between World War III or appearing to back down. So this is a very bad idea, especially as Taiwan, unlike Cuba, exports the most valuable semiconductors on the planet. Cuba exports, remind me?
Cigars.
Cigars. Like, I like cigars, okay, occasionally. But they're certainly not as crucial to the global economy as the GPUs that get manufactured by TSMC. So if you had a crisis over Taiwan, it would be a massive economic sell-off. It would be carnage in markets. But it would also be like World War III in potential, and that would be an extremely dangerous situation to be in. So that's why détente.
But against that backdrop that you've painted, it's not clear to me what détente would mean. And also, I think you've acknowledged that on the right, the view was in certain quarters that détente in the original Cold War benefited the Soviet Union. There were many people who felt it was a form of appeasement.
Yeah, I mean, this was in large measure Ronald Reagan's doing. And one of the interesting things about writing Volume 2 is that you get a chance to rethink the 70s and the 80s. Now, I'm very much a kind of child of the 60s, and I was an undergraduate in the early 80s and an ardent Thatcherite and Reaganite. You'll be very surprised to hear that, I'm sure. And it's kind of interesting to go back and realize the things about Reagan that were not quite as I remembered them. I mean, two, really. One, the extreme unfairness of the criticism of détente, which portrayed it as appeasement, which it really was not. Détente was a deeply clear-eyed attempt to engage the Soviets, not to trust them, to recognize them for what they were, but to try to slow down the arms race. And that was rational because, particularly after Vietnam, the United States couldn't afford to keep increasing the defense budget. And détente bought the United States about 10 years to recover from the disaster of Vietnam, after which it was possible to get hawkish, as Reagan did. But then, what's interesting is that Reagan was hawkish initially, but only briefly. And then very quickly, he wasn't that hawkish. He was not at all hawkish when the martial law was imposed in Poland. And he ended up doing détente plus over intermediate nuclear forces with Gorbachev. In fact, it's funny to find in the 1980s Kissinger criticizing Reagan for being too soft on the Soviet Union. So, you realize with hindsight that détente was not, in fact, as Reagan portrayed it, and that he ended up doing it himself. What détente means is you engage with the communist superpower on a whole range of different fronts. You negotiate with them about arms control, AI arms control, nuclear arms control. You can negotiate with them about anything you like. They want to negotiate about semiconductors. Good, do that. Let's have a negotiation about semiconductors. The more of those negotiations that are going on, the less likely the Taiwan semiconductor crisis is to happen. And time. Time is on our side, the West side, much more than it's on China's side. China's demographics are a disaster. The population will halve between now and the end of the century. The economy is ground down under a mountain of debt so great that they can't really do fiscal stimulus anymore. Young people are deeply disillusioned. I talk to my Chinese friends. When they risk it, they say things that shock me about their view of the leadership. Like Iran, the Chinese regime is not strong, it's not healthy. And so the rational thing for the United States and its allies must be to play for time and let the pathologies of the one-party state play out. I think that's the real argument for détente. The thing that would help Xi Jinping a lot right now would be a great showdown over Taiwan, because then he could mobilize national sentiment, etc. So I'm a convert to détente as a clear-eyed strategy of playing for time.
One more from me, maybe one and a half. I've tried not to ask too many questions. I know you're all bursting to ask questions too. You're a co-founder of the University of Austin, which describes itself as being dedicated to the fearless pursuit of truth. Why? Why did you get involved in the project?
Well, if you look at what's going on at American universities, established American universities today, Harvard post-October the 7th, Stanford has not been a great deal better. What's been going on at Columbia in the last few days, you realize, I think, the truth of what I and others have been saying for about 10 years. There's something rotten at the heart of American academia. You can give it various names, wokeism for short, but it's a curious phenomenon in which radical ideas, progressive leftism, but sometimes Islamism, have taken more and more control of what can and cannot be discussed. And a culture of fear has been created in which one can't speak freely for fear of cancellation. This is measurable in all kinds of ways, but I'll give you just one example. 59% of undergraduates right across the US say they can't speak their minds in class for fear of what might happen. That is, to me, utterly appalling. that universities should be places where there is less free speech than in a saloon bar in Wisconsin. I would never have foreseen that in the 1980s when I went into academic life, believing that I would have the most intellectual freedom as a professor that I could have. And that has ceased to be true. We now have less intellectual freedom. Tenured professors have their careers destroyed because they are deemed to have said something inappropriate about Black Lives Matter. This stinks. This is how you kill a civilization, if you turn its universities into places that enforce intellectual conformism and orthodoxy. So we reached the point, Joe Lonsdale, Barry Weiss, and I, and a few others, Pano Canelos, we decided that the only solution was to create a new university because the old ones just couldn't be fixed. And the only way to show people that academic freedom is important and matters, and that the pursuit of truth is what universities are for, not indoctrination, was to create one, model it, and if we get it right, and we've only had 2 years to do this, then I think we'll exert some pressure on the established institutions.
I mean, you've taught at Stanford and Harvard, some of the preeminent institutions in the world. Did your students turn on you? What was your experience?
Well, I didn't teach at Stanford because the history department said that they didn't want somebody so conservative. I was a Hoover Senior Fellow when I arrived in 2016. I'd been, I think, one of the most popular history professors at Harvard for 12 years. I was rather shocked to be told that the Stanford History Department didn't really have any need for my services. My attempts to engage with undergraduates by creating a free speech series were sabotaged, I think it's fair to say. And I came to the conclusion that there were structural problems, not only there but at the other universities, that weren't going to be easy to fix, certainly not by having new presidents. And as I thought about it, as a historical problem, I began to realize that there was something a bit strange about what was happening. That a curious alliance of progressive, I don't like that word because it's actually the opposite, but let's call them illiberal academic bureaucrats, and a relatively noisy minority of radical students, plus a relative minority of radical professors, were sort of taking control of institutions and policing them and determining what could be said and what could not be said and who could be invited, with every year more disinvitations, more events cancelled. And then people started losing their jobs. I mean, tenure was supposed to protect you from that kind of thing. That was the reason that it was created. Not so that you had a cushy job for life, but so that you could say things as a professor without fear of being fired. Well, that turned out to be meaningless for Joshua Katz at Princeton, and pretty meaningless for Roland Fryer at Harvard. 2 years suspended without pay for not really anything. And so we have to, in this country, this is really important, realize the path to hell for universities has a sign that reads diversity, equity, inclusion. And you have to understand that. I'm sorry, because I know these words sound nice and nobody wants to be against them, but I have to tell you that in George Orwell's 1984 words mean the opposite of what they appear to mean. So what diversity, equity, inclusion turned out to mean at Harvard was uniformity of thought, no equity, no due process for anybody who fell foul of the Inquisition, and exclusion of conservatives and indeed anybody who was deemed to be too far to the right, including classical liberals. So British universities, British schools, please heed my warning. There is no excuse for making these mistakes when they've already been made in America over the past 10 years and the consequences are plain for all to see. If any institution that you're involved with is doing this stuff, point out where it led Harvard. When I went to Harvard in 2004, I was extremely excited. It was the best university in the world, and I really felt that I had arrived. Larry Summers was president. It was intellectually a vibrant place. Fast forward to 2023-24, and it's a laughingstock. If that's what you'd like to happen to Oxford and Cambridge, then proceed down the DEI path. But it is a path to hell. And I can't emphasize enough the lamentable folly of repeating mistakes when they so obviously have these consequences. I feel passionately about this because I was a lucky young person. I got to think freely, speak freely, take risks in classrooms, say dumb stuff in tutorials, write stupid stuff in student magazines without the thought police without the social media, without that sense that there would be terrible, irreparable consequences for my entire life. Today's 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds who are in undergraduate programs in the US live in a climate that's almost like a totalitarian light, fearful of what their comrades may say to the high authorities, worrying if the dean for student affairs or the vice provost for this or that or the diversity, equity, inclusion officer will send them the dread email saying, would you please report there's going to be an investigation into the party that you held in which somebody wore an inappropriate costume. That stuff is like something out of Stalin's Soviet Union. The secret letter of denunciation, I had one read to me once. It's sick, and we've allowed it to happen in the greatest universities in North America. Don't let's have it happen here, because young people have a profound entitlement to free thought. They have a right to be able to say stupid stuff. That's the only way you learn. I have said a lot of wrong things. I've published articles that were completely wrong. You've got to be willing to take some intellectual risk to arrive at truth. That's why we say the fearless pursuit of truth, because you have to take some risk. There's no risk in academic life anymore in America. Nobody dares step out of line. That's so sad. I would never have thought that would happen, because I thought that stuff happened in totalitarian regimes when there was a dictator in place. That in a free society, people could volunteer to write letters of denunciation about their classmates. I never thought that could happen. And yet it has. That's been one of the biggest surprises and disappointments of my life.
There is so much more to say. I think we've barely scratched the surface of so much of that. I'm going to open up the floor to all of you. There will be roving mics down here. I think there are fixed mics at the front upstairs, and there are lots of questions coming in from online. So whilst we're just getting things moving in the room, I'm going to take actually the first question that's online, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Online, John says, what's the future for Palestine if there's no state?
Well, Scotland doesn't have a state.
I think the Scots might disagree with you.
No, it doesn't have a state, not a state. I mean, it has devolution, but Scotland's not a state. There's a United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and Scotland is part of it. And I think, given that the Palestinians have blown the chance of statehood, which was really pretty much there for the taking, if you think back 20 plus years, I think the only plausible future is either they're part of an Israel in which they accept the rights and responsibilities that come with a democratic state in which there is a special place for Jews because of the historic origins of the state, or, and this is something I discussed with Kissinger in the final months of his life, or we have to think again about Jordan. We have to think again about the Palestinians' relationship with Israel's Arab neighbors, including Egypt. Kissinger said to me something which also is made clear in Martin Indick's recent book, an excellent book on Kissinger's role in the Middle East. He said it was in the end a fatal error to allow the PLO to become the representative, the official representatives of the Palestinians. And I think that's right. I think Yasser Arafat led the Palestinians in a direction that was ultimately disastrous. So there are other options, but I think if you blow statehood, then you end up as part of somebody else's bigger state. That's Scotland. Deal with it. I've dealt with it. I'm fine.
In the room, okay, there's a lady there and a gentleman here. We'll take those two, and then I'll come to you and you guys up there.
Neil, that's fantastic. Anyway, can I just ask you, because...
You can stop there. Sorry.
Henry Kissinger is one of my heroes because he's a realist, not an ideologist. He's pragmatic. And before he died, he said that he was full of praise for Ukraine's very powerful fight back against Russia. But he counseled that actually it was time to negotiate. And I would feel I agree with him, because I can see, even if Ukraine wins, okay, she wins, but then we will make a mortal enemy of Russia. And if Russia wins, we go the other way around. So when you've got a no-win, you have a Pyrrhic victory on either side, surely we shouldn't be digging deeper. We should be talking, because there are Russians in the Donbass region,
okay,
and so on and so forth. Anyway,
all right, a negotiation. Hang on, take one more.
Yeah.
Just want this gentleman here.
Professor, good to see you. I was speaking to my friend who lives in the States, and he visited me last year. And you saw that 7 of your 16 books now was on my shelf. But there's a point I want to raise today, actually tonight. You said not everyone gets a state when you were referring to Palestine. And obviously you've compared Palestine to Scotland.
That'll annoy a lot of people.
Which is quite strange. But
really?
Are you saying that the Palestinian people don't deserve to have their own state? But how can you compare Scotland to Palestine when the Scottish people live in freedom and they don't get murdered in the streets, they don't get arrested by the British police, and so on and so forth. So my point is why do you think Palestinian people don't deserve to get a state of their own like the rest of the world?
Okay.
Thank you.
Shall I take the question about Kissinger in Ukraine first? Henry went through a series of very interesting interventions in that whole saga, including a brilliant essay after the initial invasion of 2014, in which he argued that it would put Ukraine and Eastern Europe in an unsustainable position if we promised Ukraine NATO membership but never delivered it. And it would be better to have a neutral Ukraine with security guarantees than to create such an unsustainable solution. He was largely ignored, but he was right. That was an unsustainable situation. NATO membership promised but never delivered created a great jeopardy, a great danger for Ukraine. Later, he made himself unpopular by arguing, I think, prematurely for negotiations. He was booed at Davos more or less for that. But then, by the end of 2022, he'd come around to the view that Ukraine had proved itself on the battlefield a great power, a worthy power and a worthy member of the Western community. So there was a series of interventions. Ultimately, there will be negotiations. Negotiations, of course, have gone on secretly, as they do. Sergei Radchenko has a piece about the failed negotiations of 2022 just out. And I'm sure that Bill Burns has been trying to get some kind of discussion going. But it's not going to happen as long as Putin thinks he gets an early Christmas present on November 5th. And that's why I don't think there will be any meaningful negotiations until after the US election, when it becomes apparent, whoever wins, that there is not going to be an abandonment of Ukraine, and that therefore the costs to Russia of continuing the war will be very serious. If we can establish that the costs to Russia of persisting with the war are going to be intolerably high, and that some compromise peace is on offer, then a negotiation can happen. I do not think the Ukrainians should cede territory to Russia. But I don't think that they can expect to liberate the currently occupied territories by the end of 2025. I think there will be a period of limbo in which those territories are under Russian control but not recognized as ceded. And over time, as I've said to President Zelensky's advisors, you've got to be South Korea, not South Vietnam. In other words, you have to make the reconstruction of Ukraine happen even while you have a hostile neighbor on your border, just as the South Koreans did. And over time, that land will come back to you, but only if you prove that it was worth fighting for independence and democracy, because you do something with it. Do something that the Russians can never do in their occupied territory, which will just stagnate and be an economic basket case. And then once you've established, A, that it's extremely expensive to continue the war for Russia, B, that Ukraine is viable as it stands, then I think a negotiation becomes possible in the Kissingerian sense. Now, when I first made the comparison with Scotland and Palestine, my editor at Bloomberg said, no, take that out, take that out. And I said, why? Well, he said, people will just think it's ridiculous. And I said, well, listen, Sonny, you may think it's ridiculous, but you don't know any Scottish history. Let's just go back in time, shall we? Let's go back to the 17th century. The 17th century Scotland was like some cross between Gaza, West Bank, and Afghanistan. Like mountainous territory in the north full of clans that did war for fun, religious zealots in the lowlands, like the places I come from. It was incredibly dangerous and ungovernable with a homicide rate that was like, I don't know, 4 times that of England. It's far more of a problem to the English crown than Ireland. Scotland was a chronic problem, and at its most dangerous, really, in the 17th century. And it continued to be a danger until 1745, with a major revolt that threatened the English throne with a Stuart restoration by force. So nobody should downplay the violence of Scottish history, because the violence of Scottish history is up there with the best of them. And what happened in Scotland is a reminder to everybody that anything's possible. As Walter Scott writes in the great historical novel Waverley, in the space of just 60 years, Scotland went from being Afghanistan crossed with Gaza and the West Bank to being the fulcrum of the Enlightenment, where all the good ideas that have ever been had were had. You don't actually need to have any more ideas. They're all there in the thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment. And that happened in 2 generations. And it's Scott's great observation that that's amazing. It is amazing. It should give everybody hope that even the most forlorn-looking states can achieve transformation. So we have to learn from this. What do we learn? We learn that Scotland gave up its independence. Gave it up. The Scottish elite gave it up with the Union of Parliaments. Scotland became entirely subsumed into Greater Britain, became North Britain. And only in my lifetime did Scottish nationalism really become a serious political force. But they blew it. They blew it because they had a referendum and they lost it. And since they lost it, the extent of their corruption and incompetence has become steadily more visible. And so there never will be another successful referendum. There never will be one, because the Scottish Nationalist Party is a joke. Stuff happens in history. Countries go from being basket cases to being... Scotland by the late 18th century was certainly the fastest growing economy in the world. My former student Tyler Goodspeed has a great book about this. It was like the tiger economy. Anything is possible. The Palestinians had 2 distinct opportunities for a state. I think at the time of Ehud Barak, it was the most serious proposition. They walked away from it. They blew it. They blew it. And now they've blown it, I think, so irreparably that it won't be a serious topic of conversation in Israel for the rest of my life. And without that, I mean, if the Israelis don't believe in a 2-state solution, they basically stopped believing in it some time ago, but after October the 7th, it's like, you are kidding me. You're going to reward these people for the dress rehearsal of the Holocaust with a state? Nobody thinks that that's a serious opposition. That's not a serious possibility in Israeli politics today. So I think we just have to recognize that not everyone gets a state. Look at a map of Europe in, let's say, 1914. There are not that many states. There are lots of empires. Habsburg Empire, Romanov Empire, Hohenzollern Empire, lots and lots of states. Remember the Wends? Who now thinks of the Wends? The Zorbs. Been to Zorbistan lately? Not everybody gets to have a state. There were lots of new states created after World War II because the empires collapsed. But there is no real historical world in which every people that claims the right gets a state. Okay. You have to get it right diplomatically. You have to get it right politically. You have to take the win when it's handed to you, as it was. And I think the utter failure of the Palestinian Authority bears comparison with the utter failure of the SNP.
I'm going to get some more questions in whilst we can. There's a couple on this side. There's a lady there and a gentleman here. If you can put your hands back up again. Oh, there was a lady as well there. Yeah, there's two. I'll take two at a time. Yeah.
Very quick one from me. Where did you see post-Brexit Britain's place in the world?
Okay, and take the other one from that lady.
Hi, I'm a man.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's okay, no worries.
You've got a
I'm quite
very
far away,
pretty face.
Thank you, it's all right. Hi, Professor Ferguson. It's a pleasure to be here in your talk. I'm Alex Andreevich. I'm a master's student at King's College London, studying world history. I wanted to ask you, probably it's a bit off topic, but still connected to your profession as a historian. What advice do you have for PhD, maybe master's students going into their PhDs, writing their first, obviously, PhD dissertation, and the first steps after they finish that journey to become a historian in their first stages, writing their first book? What was your experience in that stage, and what can you give to aspiring young historians today in 2024? Thank you very much. I'm a big fan.
Thank you, Alex.
And a very good-looking person.
Go around saying things like, I'm a man on the Stanford campus, you get into a lot of trouble. I was a Remainer, not because I have great sentimental attachment to the ways of the Brussels bureaucracy. I was a strong opponent of a single currency, for example, and made many friends in the 90s at that time when there was a serious debate about whether Britain should join the monetary union. And so many of my friends ended up on the other side of the great debate about Brexit. And I was asked about that earlier today on a podcast for Bloomberg. And I said, the way I feel about my friends who were pro-Brexit is a little bit like that line from Succession. I love you, but you are not serious people. Because it wasn't a serious argument. It was not a serious argument that we were going to have a free trade agreement with the United States. That was a stupid, stupid thing to claim was possible. Because it's like, had they never met Bob Lighthizer? I know Bob Lighthizer. Bob Lighthizer is not going to do a free trade agreement in this country if he's alive for a millennium. And so there was this wild economic unrealism. Unlike with Trump. The Trump administration, which of course was another 2016 phenomenon, had a coherent economic strategy, which was, we're going to do tax reform that's going to incentivize investment. They did that. We're going to put tariffs on China because it's time we stopped China overtaking us economically. They did that. We're going to reduce the regulatory burdens on business. They did that. Result, US economy has been surging forward since 2017. On Trump's watch, median household income adjusted for inflation rose 10%. It had flatlined since 1999. That was a serious program, and despite all the derision that was heaped on Trump by the clever people at the New York Times, it worked. Brexit was an unserious economic program in which some hand-waving would turn Britain's divorce from its principal trading partners, its exit from the European Union, into an economic success. And it was not difficult to see that there was no way it was going to be anything other than a really expensive divorce. Now you could make an argument, as my wife and others do, that it was somehow morally, politically, ethically, constitutionally a marvelous thing. But I'm an economic historian. I'm here to tell you that's what matters. If your investment is like, the patient cannot be resuscitated, all the other stuff is not going to matter too much to the voters for too long. And so Brexit is part of, it's not the only thing, but it's part of a very serious economic problem this country has. A very, very serious problem, which is apparent when you travel beyond London and see the state of provincial Britain. It's poor. To anybody who spent the last quarter century mostly in the US, it's kind of shocking. And the fiscal position is terrible. And I pity Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. They're going to have an extraordinarily difficult task because all of the lovely things that Rachel Reeves talks about in the recent speech that was so widely praised are not, in fact, going to be affordable. So this is a very sad state of affairs, but it came out of an unseriousness. Now, the Scots were serious about independence. I remember that 2014 debate very clearly. And the question was, well, how much is this all going to cost then? And when you told them, well, actually, quite a substantial percentage of GDP, and I don't know whether you're going to keep the currency, and blah, blah, blah. Oh, in that case, no. And I remember having the same kind of discussions about Brexit with people in English pubs and Welsh pubs, even in Welsh pubs. I'm like, it's going to be really quite bad for the growth rate. You're going to be poorer in a counterfactual world. You'd definitely be better off. And, oh, we don't care about that. So I think this was the unseriousness about it. Like there was a fundamental economic unseriousness about it. And that's why the country is in this state. It doesn't give me any satisfaction to say that because I understand the impulse that was at work, but it was not serious. Now Britain is at a disadvantage because it is very hard to deliver on what Rishi Sunak said today, to increase the defence budget 2.5%, because all the other stuff is going to cost more simply because of the ageing population. And I think it's reasonable to say that large-scale immigration doesn't really solve that problem, at least not in the way that we're currently doing it. So Britain is going to struggle to be taken as seriously as we would like to be because of these economic headwinds, some of which at least we have decided to create for ourselves. Having said all that, I really admired the Prime Minister's speech today, and I think it's good that Britain has, in the great crisis over Ukraine, consistently been in the vanguard of the defense of Ukraine. And that was one of the things that Boris Johnson got right. I almost said one of the few things that Boris Johnson got right. So we aren't in as bad a position as I sometimes hear people say we are. This is the odd thing about coming home. People have become very negative about the country. And I feel like saying it's not that bad. Because Britain still, despite all that I've just said, has at least 3, maybe 4 of the world's top universities. No European country can say that, by the way. And it is, in terms of scientific research and technological development, one of the players in AI, which is, again, something that very few other countries can say. And, you know, there's one other thing about this country that is deeply, deeply moving. And you may be surprised to hear me say this. And you may not even believe me when I say it, but let me try and convince you. This country is the most racially tolerant country that I've ever been in. It is a truly astonishing thing that we have achieved. Large-scale migration, transformation of the capital city from an overwhelmingly white city to one that is perhaps the most multi-ethnic major city in the world. And the extent to which we've achieved this without any of the terrible consequences that people like Enoch Powell foretold, it should be a cause for national celebration and self-congratulation. It's not an issue that the Prime Minister's a Hindu. I really feel strongly about this. And the reason I say this is that when you compare Britain with not just the United States, where, I mean, cities are much more segregated in the United States on the whole. But you compare it with France. I've just spent a long time in Paris. I mean, Paris is 2 cities. White Paris, and then, you know, go further east. Not white Paris. But they're complete. It's shocking to be in a place like Montparnasse, and you realize that you think, oh, well, Paris hasn't changed at all. That's because there has not been assimilation and integration of the sort that we've achieved here. So as somebody who's married to an African woman, has 2 sons who are of mixed race, it is a great relief to come to a country where this isn't the issue. It is really, really important. And that's one reason why I'm very wary of importing American attitudes into our universities and schools. Because once you start sending out the questionnaire saying, are you guilty of implicit bias? Are you conscious of the color of people's skin? You start to reintroduce the very things we've succeeded in getting rid of in this country. We are quite colorblind. We really are. And that's great. We should really, really sustain that, keep it up. I want my boys to grow up in this country not feeling that the color of their skin is an issue. It shouldn't be, and thank God at least now it isn't.
I'm going to very briefly ask you to give the career advice and see if we can get a couple more questions.
Sorry, Alan, I forgot all about it. I got carried away.
Yeah.
So my first piece of advice is don't get carried away. I think it's much harder to go into the academic world today than it was when I was your age. It's harder because there are relatively few professional opportunities. There are relatively few, as the Americans would say, tenure-track jobs. So the competition is very fierce. The pay in British universities is so low that when you quote it to Americans, they say a month. And it's like, no, a year. So it's very much less attractive, I think it's fair to say. And it will become even less attractive if we decide to kind of do woke on the cheap and make the universities no longer fun places to work. I think there's a crisis in British academia beyond the elite. By the elite, I really mean Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, LSE Kings, but outside that charmed circle, it's really economically very, very tough indeed. And all my former students who've gone into academia and are working in those other universities have a really, really, really tough time. So, if I were you, I would not try to replicate my career or the career of any of my contemporaries, because I think it would be a very, very thankless task. Somebody emailed me the other day, I spoke to him today out of the blue saying, can you give me some advice? It wasn't so very different from the question that you asked. My advice to you is that you don't need to become a professor of history to be a historian. I have friends, I think of Andrew Roberts, for example, who did not do that and who've made major contributions, or Simon Sebag Montefiore. There are ways to be a historian that don't require you to take an academic job and may not even require you to do a PhD, though I personally think a PhD is a good idea. But if you're going to do it thinking in the following way. I'm going to write a book and this is the first draft. And if I make it good enough, then I can have a career as an historian. And if I'm really good, I'll be Tom Holland and I'll have my own podcast in 10 years.
Make a fortune.
We can see that there are alternative paths and that the most influential historians in Britain today are actually doing podcasts. And more strength to their arms, more strength to their arms, because I don't think the old model is currently viable for your generation. We should acknowledge that.
One more now. I haven't asked you guys. Did anybody want a question? Do you want to come up to the microphone? Probably the last one, I'm sorry.
Can you hear me? Yeah, sounds like that. I want to preface this by saying, I'm pretty balanced on the Israel-Gaza situation, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying at the beginning, especially in terms of it being Holocaust 2 in intent and the need to retaliate. I think where you lost me, though, was when you said that the operation from the IDF is a resounding success. And when you look at the realities on the ground, the 2,000-pound bombs, the chokehold on aid, the 30-to-1 combatant ratios acceptable, it seems as though it's a very angry response, a very punitive one, but not necessarily a strategic one. So asking as a historian who looks at things, the big picture, not the short term, but the long term, I'd like to ask you to revisit that point. And do you think in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, we're going to look back on this and the IDF and say this is the gold standard for how to retaliate for a abhorrent crime, and whether or not the IDF's actions are going to yield more good than bad?
Okay. It's a big question, not much time.
So you quoted a statistic there that's wrong. I mean, the reality is that the ratio of civilian to combatant casualties was initially 2-to-1 and it fell to 1-to-1 in the later stages of the conflict. The extent to which the Israelis know who the Hamas fighters are is very remarkable. In the Israeli Defense Ministry, there's an entire wall of headshots of the Hamas fighters, with most of them crossed out. It's not been a lack of precision that we have seen. The use of non-precision munitions is because the precision ones are needed for Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a much, much more serious foe than Hamas because Hezbollah has a vast arsenal of missiles pointed at Israel. And so the IDF couldn't afford to use its most sophisticated weaponry against Hamas. The bigger fight has still to come. You know, the Israeli defense minister wanted to fight Hezbollah first on the ground that you have to fight the stronger of your enemies before you fight the weaker one. The complexities of war are often lost in the emotional responses that we as civilians, and I'm assuming you're a civilian, feel. What is this battle for Gaza like? That's the right question for a historian to ask. When was the last time an army had to fight against an enemy that was not just entrenched, but in tunnels, deep, deep, sophisticated tunnel networks with the civilian population on the surface? You can't find many examples, but one that comes to mind is Okinawa. If you start making serious comparisons between the Gaza operation and battles like it, you could maybe talk in terms of Mosul too. The thing that's striking to me is that the Israelis have achieved their objective, which was to destroy Hamas, at a far lower cost than in comparable battles in comparable situations. This is not to say it's all fine. This is not to say it's great. I have struggled to convey in my writing, but I've tried, the compassion that I feel for all people who get caught up in war, including the soldiers, including the people who find themselves in the tunnels. But that's a recurrent theme of my work. That's why I wrote The Pity of War. That's why I wrote War of the World, to try to convey the horror of war. I became a historian partly reading the war poets as a schoolboy in Glasgow and then having to go and drill in the combined cadet force on a Monday afternoon, and the cognitive dissonance was powerful to me. One of the things that struck me writing Kissinger's biography was that he had experienced war at first hand. He'd been in the Battle of the Bulge. He'd been there. He'd been at the liberation of a concentration camp. When his critics hurl terms like war criminal and genocide at him, I think, really? You think that experience made him somehow numb as opposed to highly sensitized? And this will be a theme of the second volume. What's happened in Gaza has been hellish. Hellish. If only it had been possible to root Hamas out with no civilian casualties. If only. If only the same could have been done in Okinawa, where the civilian casualties were vastly higher, and so were the US casualties. But that's not war. War isn't like that. There are no surgical strikes. Did you know that was a term Kissinger invented? It's a kind of ironical term, surgical strikes. It's very, very hard to make any military action surgical. But I think when we consider the situation that we've witnessed in the Middle East, we have to bear in mind that what happened was Israel attempted to create a Palestinian state. That was attempted on 2 occasions and offered to the Palestinians. In the end, the Palestinians elected the path of violence. And when they were dissatisfied with the PLO, they turned to Hamas. They voted Hamas in. Hamas is a criminal organization. It's a criminal organization that sacrifices its own young men and then collects the money and sends it to the leadership and sit around in Qatar having a good time. I mean, the depravity of Hamas is hard to overstate. That's the tragedy. Let's not confuse perpetrators and victims, especially not in connection with the Jewish people, please. So it's a grim subject. I wish there were some cheerful way to discuss it. I wish there was some immediate end in sight, except that there isn't. There's another war to come with Hezbollah. But I passionately believe, and everybody in this room should believe, whether they're Jewish or not, that history has necessitated a Jewish state. It has made it clear that the Jewish people cannot take the risk of not having a state again, that they have every right to have that state in the Holy Land where the Jewish people have had a presence for centuries, and that those who would eradicate them from the river to the sea must be defeated, and we must help in their defeat. That's my view, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, plenty to chew over there. Thank you all so much. Thank you for your great questions. Thank you for being here, and hope to see you again at another Intelligence Squared event. Thank you to Neil.
Thank you.